I never imagined a simple Thursday night could unravel everything I thought was solid. You either trust me or you read the problem, he said, snapping as he packed for a weekend trip. 3 men. That was the only detail I needed to feel my stomach twist. I tried to keep my voice calm, almost rational. Okay, do what you want. Open the door and let him perform his freedom. But inside, something sharp cracked. Days later, one of those men reached out. That's when the full weight of the truth hit me. My boyfriend, Graham, 29, full of charm, marketing manager for a fitness chain, was someone I had trusted completely. We had been together for 2 years, sharing a home in Aurora, Colorado. Bills split fairly, plans discussed openly, routines so natural they felt like breathing. No major red flags, or so I thought. I am a project manager at a mid-sized construction company. Life in Colorado was simple but steady. Hikes on weekends, DIY projects at home, occasional brewery visits with friends. My world was predictable, safe, and, most importantly, grounded. Graham and I had met through mutual friends at a brewery, and the connection had been immediate, magnetic. Moving in together felt inevitable. It was more like a merging of lives we were already living side by side. That Thursday evening, he came home radiant, excitement bubbling from every word. Kelsey's planning a guys' weekend in Moab in 3 weeks, guys, he announced. My mind automatically began calculating. Projects to tackle, errands to postpone, schedules to adjust. But then he casually added, Kelsey's inviting her brother and 2 of his friends. So, 4 guys, 3 girls. Isn't it fun? Fun? My chest tightened. I tried to speak calmly, carefully. Babe, that's not really a guy's trip anymore. That's different. He laughed lightly, but I saw the hardness behind his eyes. Guys and girls can be friends. Don't you trust me? I froze. I had heard this line before, decades ago, in my own family. My dad, endlessly criticized for setting boundaries while my mother's book club trips hid emotional affairs. And now, history was repeating itself. I'm not asking permission, he continued. I'm telling you I'm going. If you trust me, this shouldn't be an issue. If you don't, maybe we have bigger problems. His words didn't float. They landed like ice shards, cold and precise. I realized in that moment, this wasn't a conversation. It was a test, a power play. I took a deep breath, the calm before the storm. Then here's option 3, I said, my voice steady. You pack your stuff. Be out by Sunday night. Color drained from his face. What? You don't ask for my input, I said. You don't ask for my blessing. You tell me you're doing something that crosses a boundary and frame it as me being insecure. That's not a relationship I want. Start packing. Tears, accusations, pleading. Nothing moved me. I watched him crumble and realized, in a surreal clarity, that this night would change everything. I'm Sophie, 29, a project manager at a mid-sized construction company in Colorado. I've always been meticulous, the type who plans every weekend hike or home improvement project with military precision. My life was stable, maybe even predictable, but I liked it that way. I had worked hard for my apartment in Aurora, saving every penny for years, and I loved the quiet victories. A freshly painted wall, a deck finally finished, a Sunday morning spent in pajamas with coffee in hand. I liked control, but I also liked connection, and Graham promised both. I first met him at a crowded brewery downtown. Mutual friends had dragged us into the same group, and I remember his laugh cutting through the background noise. It was warm, confident, the kind that made you feel like you had known him forever. Conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about music, hiking trails, and our slightly obsessive love for planning things. He was clever, ambitious, and funny, and I found myself hanging on to his every word. By the end of that night, I knew I wanted more than just casual friendship. We started dating soon after, the kind of relationship that felt natural, inevitable. Our weekends became intertwined. Hikes up Lookout Mountain, brewery nights, home-cooked dinners, and Sunday brunches. I adored how he made me laugh and how, somehow, I could be myself around him. We moved in together after a few months. Almost by default, we were already at each other's apartments more than our own. It felt right. Home was wherever we were together. For the first year, everything was effortless, almost intoxicating. Graham's charm made him universally adored. Friends, colleagues, even my family liked him immediately. He knew how to navigate people, smooth over awkward moments, and make everyone feel comfortable. But there were tiny signs I had dismissed. Late nights at the gym, with friends that stretched into early mornings, the occasional vague text he quickly locked his phone over, little excuses I had shrugged off, because, well, I trusted him. My family adored him too. My parents called him their perfect boyfriend within weeks, and my younger sister begged me to let him teach her boyfriend a few manners. But as close as we were to each other's families, I often felt Graham's boundaries with my family were fluid. He joked, sometimes too sharply, about my dad being overprotective. He nodded along when my mom made offhanded comments about my obsessive control over our shared schedules. I ignored these, chalking them up to his playful banter. We had dreams together, weekend getaways, future vacations, even tentative plans to buy a bigger home in a few years. I felt, naively, that this was the person I would build my adult life with. We split bills fairly, handled chores together, and spoke openly about the future. I thought our foundation was solid, built on mutual respect and trust. I didn't notice how Graham had slowly started framing the narrative of our relationship on his terms. Even when small tensions arose, like when he disagreed with me about hosting friends over or how to spend a weekend, I dismissed them. I told myself I was overthinking, that disagreements were normal, healthy even. I never imagined that those little seeds of tension were quietly taking root, setting the stage for the night that would shatter my sense of safety. By the time Thursday night came, the night of the ultimatum, I thought I knew him. I thought I trusted him. I thought we were equals, partners navigating life together. But as soon as he mentioned this trip, my stomach twisted in a way that said otherwise. Something I had overlooked for 2 years, the subtle control, the manipulation disguised as independence, was now impossible to ignore. The past and present collided in that moment, and the realization hit me like a wave. Love wasn't always enough. I tried to ignore it at first. That uneasy churning in my stomach when Graham casually dropped news about the trip seemed like paranoia, maybe even my own overthinking. But the more I replayed his words, the more a pattern emerged. Over the past few months, little inconsistencies had started cropping up. A text deleted too quickly, a sudden need to help friends move late at night, excuses that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. I had dismissed them as the quirks of a busy, independent man. But now, in the quiet of my living room, I couldn't shake the unease. Family and friends unknowingly fueled my growing doubts. My sister, who had always adored Graham, kept making offhand comments about how he really needs his space, or guys just have their own code. They were harmless words, but in the context of the weekend trip with strangers, they felt like pressure, a silent push to dismiss my discomfort. My mother, too, called one night, praising Graham for being adventurous and trusting, subtly implying that perhaps I was overreacting. And then there was the way Graham's friends spoke about him. Casual jokes about how he could handle any situation with charm now seemed pointed. One friend commented on social media about how freedom in a relationship is key, tagging Graham and a few mutual friends. I read it and felt my chest tighten. There it was again, the subtle messaging. Independence framed as a virtue, my discomfort framed as weakness. I began replaying moments in my head, trying to pinpoint when I had first let my guard down. The late-night work calls that never really ended. The unexplained trips to the gym or bars that seemed innocent but coincided with odd absences. Small flinches in his eyes when I asked where he'd been. I had ignored all of it, trusting my own judgment, telling myself that love meant giving him space. Now, each tiny memory felt like a warning sign I had erased from my mind. Even our home routines started to feel off. The way he would casually rearrange plans without consulting me or insist on doing things his way with an air of finality planted seeds of tension. I found myself hesitating before speaking, wondering if voicing a boundary would provoke resistance. That unease, once fleeting, was growing into a persistent knot in my chest. I also noticed how he positioned himself socially. He was adored, and people treated him as the voice of reason, the charming mediator. If a situation arose, his perspective carried more weight than mine. Friends often sought his opinion before mine. Family seemed to unconsciously defer to him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but now it struck me as a quiet manipulation of perception. I wasn't being unreasonable, I was being sidelined. In hindsight, it all pointed to one thing. Graham had been laying the groundwork for this moment. The trip wasn't just about hiking or a social gathering. It was a test, a boundary probe, a way to gauge my reaction. And the chilling part? I had unknowingly been complicit in letting these small invasions happen. Each overlooked text, each shrugged off flinch, each excuse I accepted built up a pattern. By the time Thursday arrived, I felt the first real tremor of panic. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I finally realized what trust without respect looked like. And as he laid out the details of the trip, 3 men joining, a weekend in Moab, casual assurances of, "It's nothing, trust me," the knot in my chest tightened. Something I had buried for months, maybe years, finally demanded attention. This was more than a misunderstanding. This was control disguised as freedom. I remember standing there, heart pounding, staring at him, and thinking, this is the first real fight we've had in 2 years. But it's not just a fight, it's a revelation, and I can't ignore it anymore. Thursday night arrived like a storm I had seen coming, but still wasn't ready for. Graham came home practically buzzing, excitement radiating off him in waves. "Sophie, Kelsey's planning a weekend in Moab in 3 weeks," he said casually, tossing his backpack onto the couch. I forced a smile, nodding. "Okay, fine. A trip. Big deal." But then came the kicker. "She's inviting her brother and 2 of his friends. So 3 men joining 4 women. Isn't that fun?" Fun. The word hit me like ice water. My chest tightened. My mind raced. 3 men? Overnight? Camping? Hikes that required trust and teamwork? This wasn't a simple girls' trip anymore. I tried to keep my voice calm, measured. "Graham, that's not a girls' trip anymore. That's different." He laughed lightly, a sound that once brought me comfort, but now felt hollow. "Guys and girls can be friends. Don't you trust me?" It was the line that froze me. I'd heard it before, echoed through generations. My father's protests about boundaries dismissed for decades, my mother's book club weekends that hid emotional betrayals. History had a way of repeating itself. And now I realized I was facing the same pattern. "I'm not asking permission," Graham continued, eyes fixed on mine. "I'm telling you I'm going. If you trust me, it shouldn't be an issue. If you don't, maybe we have bigger problems." My mind swirled. This isn't a discussion. This is a test, a power play. My heartbeat quickened, adrenaline sharp in my veins. I remembered every subtle sign I'd ignored over the past months. The deleted texts, the last-minute plans, the dismissive laughs when I expressed concern. All of it led to this. I drew in a slow, deliberate breath, forcing calm into my voice. "Then here's option 3, I said, standing, my back straight, hands gripping the edge of the couch. "You pack your things. Be out by Sunday night." For a split second, his face betrayed shock. "What? You don't ask for my input. You don't ask for my blessing. You tell me you're doing something that crosses a boundary and frame it as me being insecure. That's not a relationship I want. Start packing." Silence. Then anger, disbelief, tears. A tidal wave of emotion I had seen before, but never experienced from this side. "You're being controlling. You're overreacting. How can you do this to us?" His voice cracked, pleading and accusatory all at once. I felt the familiar pang of hurt, but also clarity. Every word he said confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't punishing him. I wasn't lashing out. I was setting a boundary. I was refusing to be gaslit into thinking my gut instincts, my sense of safety, my standards for respect were somehow overreactive. Friday, the messages came, long paragraphs filled with guilt and attempts to rewrite the narrative. "I didn't mean it as an ultimatum," he typed. "I just wanted to communicate my needs." Saturday morning, he showed up with Kelsey and another friend to gather his things. Kelsey shot me dirty looks, silent but pointed. Graham oscillated between tears and anger, trying one last time to frame the weekend as harmless fun. I stayed firm, polite, but unyielding. The ultimatum was already set. I wasn't negotiating. By Sunday evening, he was gone, staying at Kelsey's place across town. I watched him leave with a strange mixture of relief and lingering ache. The house felt empty, but it was a good kind of quiet, the kind where you can finally breathe without someone dictating the rhythm of your life. The aftermath was immediate. Social media messages, friends questioning my controlling behavior, Tyler texting to ask if I had overreacted. All of it was a reminder of how quickly public perception can twist reality. But in the stillness of my living room, I knew one thing: the problem wasn't me. It was the dynamic he had chosen to create, testing my boundaries under the guise of independence. That night, as I sat alone on the couch, I realized that Thursday had broken something fundamental. Not my love for him, but the illusion that love alone could protect me from manipulation. My trust in him had been real, but trust without respect wasn't enough. And for the first time in months, I felt the stark, unshakable clarity. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, and some ultimatums are not negotiations. They are revelations. After Thursday night, the world seemed quieter but sharper at the edges. The silence in our apartment screamed at me, echoing every unspoken tension, every overlooked text, every small warning I had dismissed. My hands trembled as I ran them over the couch cushions, tracing the places where Graham had leaned, where we had laughed, where I had once felt safe. Now, that same space felt foreign, cold, and unwelcoming. I couldn't sleep. My mind spun in a loop of every moment I had ignored. The subtle evasions, the last-minute helping friends excuses, the casual dismissals when I suggested we discuss plans. I asked myself over and over, did I really miss the signs, or did I just not want to see them? Was love clouding my judgment, or was I just too trusting? By Friday morning, I was exhausted, but exhaustion didn't help. I scrolled through our past messages, reread shared photos, and felt the slow burn of betrayal. The trust I had placed in him felt like fragile glass, shattered by a casual ultimatum and weeks of manipulation disguised as casual fun. Every memory of our shared laughter now carried a tinge of doubt. Yet, beneath the shock, a steady voice whispered, "You knew your boundaries. You set them. You were clear, and you were ignored." That quiet recognition was the first seed of clarity. It told me that this wasn't about overreacting. It was about self-respect, about refusing to let my feelings be dismissed or reframed as irrational. Later that morning, I texted Graham, carefully composing words that balanced firmness and clarity. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I stated facts, recounted boundaries, and asked for accountability. His response oscillated between defensiveness and pleading, tears and anger, but it never acknowledged the core issue, that he had crossed a boundary and made it about my supposed insecurity rather than his behavior. I found myself reflecting on my upbringing, on the patterns I had observed in my parents. My mother had dismissed my father's concerns for decades, calling him controlling when he only sought respect and clarity. Watching that dynamic had taught me empathy, but also caution. I realized now that I had inherited a sense of vigilance, a subconscious alertness to those dynamics, and I could see the same script unfolding in my own life. That evening, I sat on our balcony with a cup of tea, the cool night air brushing against my skin, trying to process the emotional storm. My heart ached, not just for the relationship, but for the illusion I had cherished, the idea that love alone could protect me from harm, from manipulation, from the slow erosion of trust. I felt sorrow, yes, but also an unexpected clarity. I called my friend Tyler, the one who had always been honest with me, and poured out everything. The trip, the power play, the manipulation disguised as fun, and my heartbreak. Tyler listened, quietly, without judgment, then asked a simple but profound question. "Sophie, are you being punished for having boundaries, or are you being manipulated into questioning them?" The question hit me like a punch. I realized the difference between guilt and manipulation, between compromise and surrender. I began to see the situation not as a personal failure, but as a test that Graham had set up for me. And I recognized that refusing to be manipulated wasn't just an act of self-preservation. It was an assertion of my worth. By Saturday, the messages had become almost constant. Graham oscillated between apologies, anger, and attempts to justify the trip. Kelsey's side glances, the way she framed the weekend as a healing adventure, only intensified my resolve. I refused to respond with emotion. Instead, I crafted my replies with precision, short, firm, clear. Boundaries were not negotiable. Respect was not optional. For the first time in months, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and empowerment. Sorrow for what I had hoped the relationship could be, empowerment for recognizing what it wasn't, and refusing to be complicit in its manipulations. I realized that this was the first step in reclaiming my agency, in preparing for the fallout, and in protecting my emotional integrity. By the time Saturday night came, I understood the truth. This relationship was not failing because of love lost. It was failing because manipulation disguised as fun, ultimatums disguised as choice, and blurred boundaries had replaced respect and communication. And I was no longer willing to ignore it. The weekend felt like a battlefield. Graham's messages had escalated from desperate apologies to thinly veiled accusations. Every notification on my phone made my chest tighten, the rhythm of my heartbeat quickening as if anticipating a physical blow rather than a text. But it wasn't just him anymore. Kelsey had begun subtly reaching out, framing the weekend as everyone having fun, no harm meant. Even some of our mutual friends chimed in online, questioning my reaction, suggesting I was overreacting, that perhaps I was too controlling or not trusting enough. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the light from the pendant lamp casting a warm glow, yet everything around me felt harsh and cold. My fingers traced the edge of my mug, feeling the faint warmth, grounding me as I tried to sort through the swirling mess of emotions. I thought of my parents' marriage again, how my mother had framed my father as controlling for wanting clear boundaries, how my father had stayed silent, shrinking under accusations that weren't his to bear. History had a way of repeating itself, and I refused to be trapped in that cycle. When Graham tried calling, I let it go to voicemail. His voice was urgent, almost pleading, and a small, instinctive part of me wanted to pick up, to soothe, to explain. But I caught myself. No. This is about boundaries. This is about respect, and you've already crossed the line. I began drafting a response, carefully articulating my feelings and the non-negotiable boundaries he had violated. I sent it, concise yet firm. No excuses, no emotional outpouring, just clarity. Then came the family intervention. Graham's sister Mara called, feigning concern. "Sophie, he's just excited about the trip. You're overreacting. Don't ruin this for him. Don't be unreasonable." Her tone was soft, almost motherly, but the message was unmistakable. The narrative was already forming, and I was the villain. I felt a surge of frustration, a flash of anger. The invasion was subtle but unmistakable, family siding with him, assuming my emotions were wrong, framing me as the problem. I paused and took a deep breath. This was exactly why I had hesitated when the first red flags appeared. Outside voices, advice, and assumptions often overshadowed reality. I had to hold my ground. So I texted Mara back, carefully measured. "I appreciate your concern. My boundaries are not negotiable. Graham's behavior crossed a line. I am asserting my right to respect and clear communication." Friends began messaging, too, a mix of subtle judgment and outright support. Some whispered that I might be overreacting. Some reassured me I was right, and some seemed almost curious about how this drama would unfold. The pressure cooker intensified. I felt my resolve tested, but each message, each phone call, only strengthened my clarity. This wasn't about popularity or being liked. It was about truth and my sense of personal integrity. Saturday afternoon brought another layer of tension. Graham's packing had begun. Kelsey hovered nearby, feigning helpfulness while making pointed remarks. "You're really making this dramatic, you know. It's just a trip." Graham looked torn, guilt, frustration, and something else flickering in his eyes. A momentary vulnerability, but it didn't excuse the boundary violations. I observed him, noting the subtle gestures, the way his shoulders slumped, the nervous tapping of his foot, the quick flicks of his eyes to see if I was watching. I realized that even in guilt, there was a sense of entitlement. He hadn't fully grasped that respect was more than verbal acknowledgement. Respect required action, and he had failed. As the packing continued, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I thought about the future I wanted, a life where my boundaries were recognized, my emotions validated, my autonomy respected. I realized that conceding now, bending to their collective pressure, would not only compromise this relationship, but also set a precedent that would echo into every decision we made together. I could no longer let fear of conflict dictate my choices. By evening, the tension had reached a crescendo. Kelsey and Graham attempted one last plea, a mix of guilt-tripping, flattery, and subtle manipulation. I listened, silent, letting the words wash over me without letting them penetrate. I didn't argue. I didn't justify myself. I simply stated what had been set in motion. Boundaries crossed are not negotiable. Respect is non-negotiable. The trip does not change that. They left the apartment. Silence settled in again, heavier now, layered with the echoes of confrontation, texts, calls, and subtle manipulations. I sat in the living room, heart still racing, but mind clearer than it had been for weeks. I felt the first real stirrings of empowerment, a sense that I could weather external pressures, social judgments, and emotional manipulation without losing myself. That night, I journaled everything, pouring emotions onto paper. The guilt, the sorrow, the frustration, the anger, all laid bare. Writing helped me disentangle the chaos. I wrote about the manipulation disguised as harmless fun, the pressure from friends and family, and the stark reality of what a relationship without respect looks like. The act of writing became cathartic, a mirror reflecting the truth I needed to see. By Sunday morning, I had made a decision. The ultimatum was not just about the trip, it was a revelation of character. Graham had chosen manipulation over communication, pressure over partnership, and I had chosen clarity over compromise. I felt a strange peace settle in, an understanding that the difficult path, asserting boundaries, facing judgment, holding firm, was also the path to self-respect. Sophie had learned, in the most visceral way possible, that escalation was inevitable when manipulation met strong boundaries, and she had survived it. More than survived. She had gained clarity, a sense of her own worth, and the strength to move forward. Sunday night arrived like a heavy curtain. The apartment felt too quiet, each tick of the clock amplified in the emptiness. Sophie sank into the corner of the sofa, hugging her knees, eyes fixed on nothing, as if staring could make the chaos outside disappear. The texts, calls, and the stares of friends and family replayed in her mind like a broken record. Every message questioning her reaction, every whispered judgment, every sly defense of Graham gnawed at her. She felt betrayed, not just by Graham, but by the people around her. Friends who should have supported her now seemed unsure where their loyalties lay. Mara's well-meaning but manipulative words echoed, suggesting she was overreacting or misreading the situation. Even Tyler, who had been a steady voice of reason, couldn't be there physically to shield her from the suffocating isolation. The betrayal cut deep. Sophie realized that love alone hadn't protected her. Her trust had been exploited. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as tears blurred her vision. How could someone she loved, someone she had shared her life with, treat her boundaries like obstacles rather than markers of respect? The realization was like icy water poured over her chest. She could feel every betrayal, every slight, every overlooked plea to communicate, and it all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. She had been deceived. Memories flashed relentlessly. Lazy Sunday mornings, shared breakfasts, the warmth of his hand in hers, laughter echoing through their apartment. And then the ultimatum, the dismissive words, the trip, the flirting with others, the lies. Every cherished memory now carried a shadow. Sophie felt as if the floor beneath her had vanished, leaving her suspended over a void of disappointment and grief. The house was silent except for her shallow breathing. She had always prided herself on being independent, confident, and rational. Yet in this moment, all of that seemed insufficient. Self-doubt crept in insidiously. Had I misjudged? Had I been too strict? Too controlling? Was I really overreacting? The questions circled endlessly, taunting her, each one threatening to erode the clarity she had fought so hard to establish. Late into the night, she reached for her phone, tempted to reach out one last time, to beg for explanations, to salvage the fragments of a relationship that had already fractured, but she stopped. The moment she considered breaking the boundaries she had set, she felt a surge of anger, Not at Graham, not at Kelsey, but at herself. She recognized that yielding now would validate manipulation, give weight to deceit, and undermine everything she valued. Instead, she turned to the quiet solace of her own thoughts. She remembered her mother's warnings about her father's marriage, the way control had been framed as insecurity, the long years of unspoken compromises that had eroded trust. Sophie thought of the life she wanted, one where her voice mattered, her boundaries were respected, and trust was not a weapon. The comparison hurt. She realized she could either allow herself to be trapped in a repeating cycle or step away while she still had dignity. Sophie's eyes wandered to the framed photos of their happier days. She touched the glass lightly, tracing Graham's smiling face. "I loved you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But love doesn't excuse betrayal. Love doesn't excuse disrespect." Her chest tightened, the tears streaming freely now. The sorrow was raw, suffocating, yet necessary. It marked the breaking point, the moment when despair forced recognition of truth. Hours passed. The darkness of the room mirrored the darkness of her emotions. She felt utterly alone, unsupported, and misunderstood. But within that despair, a faint ember glimmered, a sense of resilience, a spark of clarity buried beneath the grief. Sophie realized that this low point was not the end. It was a necessary precursor to the empowerment that would follow. The depth of her pain revealed the magnitude of the boundaries she had defended and the courage she had summoned to do so. By early Monday morning, exhaustion overtook despair. Her tears had dried, her body ached, yet the ember inside her grew warmer. The betrayal, the judgment, and the loneliness had done their work. They had stripped away illusions, exposing the core truth. Sophie deserved respect, honesty, and partnership. She deserved to be seen, not manipulated. She deserved clarity, not ultimatums. As the first rays of dawn crept through the blinds, Sophie sat upright, wiping the remnants of sleep and tears from her eyes. The apartment was quiet, yes, but this time it felt less oppressive and more like a blank canvas. The darkness had revealed her lowest point, but it had also illuminated the path forward. She understood now that the turning point was near, that the power, the agency, and the clarity she sought were within reach if she dared to claim them. Monday morning felt heavier than any morning Sophie could remember, yet there was a strange sharpness in the air, as if the universe had drawn a line and told her, "Choose clearly." She sat at the edge of the bed, coffee cooling in her hands, staring at her phone. There it was, the screenshots Brad had sent, the undeniable proof. Images of Graham, laughing, touching, teasing, and manipulating the boundaries she had clearly set. Every word, every gesture in those screenshots left no room for misinterpretation. It wasn't just about the trip anymore. It was about the pattern, the deliberate avoidance of accountability, the casual twisting of reality, the insistence that her feelings were invalid. Sophie scrolled slowly, stomach churning, heart pounding, yet something inside her steadied. Every manipulated moment, every silent dismissal, every accusation that she was overreacting suddenly crystallized into a single truth. She had been entirely right to trust her instincts. Her phone buzzed. Tyler. She glanced at the screen. He had noticed her silence and came by with the six-pack the night before. She smiled faintly, thinking back to their conversation on the porch, his awkward but genuine apology, the way he had slowly started seeing the value in boundaries. He got it. Finally. Sophie called him. His familiar voice was grounding. "Sophie, everything okay?" "I need to show you something," she said, her voice steady. She forwarded Brad's messages, the screenshots, the texts. Tyler's responses were immediate, a mix of disbelief and support. "Holy, you're not imagining this. That's insane." She leaned back, a quiet, internal relief settling over her. It wasn't validation she craved. She already knew the truth, but seeing it acknowledged by someone neutral, someone who could see the situation clearly, made her own perspective feel concrete, unshakable. Later that afternoon, she sat in the living room, the sunlight spilling across the floorboards, illuminating the boxes of Graham's belongings waiting to be taken. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers curling into the fabric of her jeans. She allowed herself a deep exhale, the kind that carries out the tension and leaves only clarity in its wake. For the first time in days, she could see the power dynamic clearly. This wasn't about compromise or negotiation. This wasn't about trying to fix someone else's disregard for respect. This was about reclaiming her life and choosing dignity over drama. The ultimatum, the lies, the manipulation, they were a mirror of past patterns she had witnessed, the same cycle that had destroyed so many relationships in her family. She would not be trapped in that pattern. Sophie made a decision. She would not argue, negotiate, or rationalize. She would assert her boundaries and remove herself from the situation with calm precision. The moment she had been preparing for, the moment that would define her own agency, had arrived. That evening, when Graham arrived to gather the last of his things, she greeted him with a composed demeanor. No tears, no accusations, just quiet strength. He hesitated, clearly expecting confrontation or emotional bargaining, but found none. "Graham," she said, voice steady, eyes meeting his. "The trip, the ultimatum, the lies, they were not acceptable. I am not interested in being in a relationship where my boundaries are disregarded and my feelings are manipulated." He tried to interject, to soften it, to explain away his actions, but she held up a hand. "I'm not here to argue. The decision is clear. You've made your choice. I'm making mine." He faltered, searching her eyes for any crack, any sign of weakness. There was none. Sophie watched as realization and frustration washed over him. For the first time, he saw that she was immovable, that the power lay not in manipulation, but in clarity, composure, and self-respect. The boxes were loaded into his car in silence. Not a single word of blame from her, not a single attempt to persuade him to stay. Just quiet authority, the kind that comes from knowing one's worth. When the trunk closed and the engine started, she felt an unexpected surge of peace. She returned to the apartment, the familiar space now quiet and hers. No one had to validate her. No one had to witness her reclaiming her life. She had already done it internally, firmly, and with unshakable resolve. The turning point had arrived, not through confrontation, not through drama, but through clarity, recognition of truth, and the conscious choice to prioritize her dignity. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe freely. The betrayal, the manipulation, the drama, they had all been tests, and she had passed. Not by bending, not by pleading, not by proving anything to anyone, but by staying true to herself. Sophie realized that the turning point wasn't the end of pain. It was the end of compromise with her own integrity. It was the moment she stepped fully into her power, ready to leave the past behind and reclaim control of her life. The days that followed were quieter than Sophie expected, but they were far from simple. The apartment, once filled with shared laughter and routine, was now a sanctuary for her thoughts. Boxes of Graham's belongings were gone, his presence erased physically, yet the ripple effects of his actions spread through their social circle like water in a disturbed pond. Friends began to murmur, some privately, others publicly. Sophie observed the subtle shifts in interactions. Questions asked a little too cautiously, mentions of the incident that danced around the truth. Yet she refused to engage. She would not defend herself, would not justify her choices, would not provide fodder for debate. Her silence became her shield, her composure a quiet testament to the clarity she had gained. Graham's reputation began to crumble slowly but unmistakably. Friends who had once accepted his version of events now saw inconsistencies in his story. Tyler, loyal as ever, became a discreet voice of reason in the background, sending Sophie updates she sometimes chose to ignore, other times quietly absorbing. It was clear that the same people who had doubted her instinct were now questioning his integrity. Sophie didn't celebrate this. It was not revenge, but natural fallout. Truth, when left unchallenged, has a way of surfacing. Social media posts became a battlefield of perception. Graham's attempts to frame the breakup as Sophie's overreaction fell flat, and the screenshots she had shared with Tyler, carefully preserved, quietly did their work. Mutual friends reached out, some apologetic, some curious, many relieved to understand the real dynamics. Sophie responded sparingly, short, composed messages that neither inflamed nor placated. She had learned that her voice mattered, but not every opinion deserved her energy. Meanwhile, Sophie focused on herself. Work became an anchor. Projects that had been postponed or ignored during the turbulence were now her domain. She spent evenings refining the deck she had started months ago, building her basement gym into a space that was entirely hers, a private haven where she could process, reflect, and grow. Hikes on Lookout Mountain became meditation, time alone with the wind and open sky. The simple rhythm of her life returned, punctuated not by drama, but by deliberate choice and agency. Tyler's presence remained steady, a reminder that support could be present without interference. They shared meals, beers, and long talks about boundaries, respect, and self-worth. He openly admitted how observing Sophie's composure had reshaped his own understanding of respect in relationships. Sophie smiled at the thought. Sometimes the strongest lessons are taught simply by living them, by showing rather than arguing. Family dynamics, too, began to heal. Conversations with her mother and father became deeper, more reflective. Her mother admitted pride at Sophie's steadfastness, while cautioning her to always trust her instincts. Her father, once distant since his own divorce, reconnected with quiet wisdom, sharing reflections on his past choices and reinforcing the value of self-respect over compromise that erodes dignity. Sophie listened, absorbed, and allowed herself to feel the support she had so often yearned for. Graham's attempts to regain control, whether through mutual friends or social channels, were met with polite distance or neutral silence. He tried messaging, but Sophie did not respond. She did not block him out of fear or anger. She simply recognized that no amount of argument, explanation, or denial could alter her reality. Her boundary was firm, her decision irreversible. She had reclaimed her life, and that reclamation required no justification. By the end of the week, Sophie had a quiet victory. The apartment felt hers again, a place of peace rather than tension. The few close friends who mattered had rallied quietly, offering support without judgment. The storm of gossip and speculation gradually lost momentum, as truth and her composure acted as natural moderators. Sophie no longer carried the weight of someone else's manipulation or the anxiety of social opinion. She was anchored, self-aware, and resolutely independent. In those quiet moments alone, Sophie reflected on the lessons etched into the experience. Respect is earned, not demanded. Boundaries are not negotiable, and self-worth is not a bargaining chip. Love is not a license to disregard the feelings of others. And sometimes, the most profound form of power is not confrontation or revenge, but calm exit, dignity intact, and clarity unshaken. The fallout had been harsh, yet it reinforced the strength Sophie had discovered within herself. Graham's missteps had exposed the true dynamics of their relationship, while Sophie's response had revealed a depth of maturity, resilience, and self-respect that no argument or ultimatum could diminish. By Sunday evening, the apartment was quiet, yet no longer oppressive. It was alive with potential. She had survived the betrayal, navigated the chaos, and emerged stronger. The world outside could chatter, speculate, and assign blame, but Sophie knew the truth. She had reclaimed her narrative, her peace, and her agency. For the first time since the trip, she allowed herself to smile, not out of triumph, but out of relief and clarity. The relationship had ended, yes, but Sophie had not. She was intact, empowered, and ready to step forward into the next chapter of her life with confidence, clarity, and unwavering self-respect. The quiet of the apartment was different now. It wasn't lonely, not really. It was calm, deliberate, a space reclaimed. Sophie walked through each room, touching the surfaces, noticing the sunlight through the blinds, the scent of fresh laundry. She had lived with tension and uncertainty for too long. Now everything felt intentional, measured, and hers. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and let herself reflect. The breakup with Graham had not been easy. 2 years of shared routines, laughter, and quiet intimacy had ended in days of tension, ultimatums, and emotional manipulation. Yet, in the wake of that storm, Sophie realized something profound: the value of her own instincts, her boundaries, and her integrity. No relationship, no matter how comfortable or familiar, was worth compromising who she was at her core. Her phone lay silent, free from the constant pings of arguments, accusations, or half-truths. Social media posts could swirl with gossip, friends could speculate, and Graham could spin his narrative, but Sophie no longer needed validation from anyone but herself. She had clarity, she had peace, and that was worth more than any apology or reconciliation. Sophie reflected on the lessons she had learned. Trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. Boundaries are not controlling. They are necessary for healthy connections. Ultimatums and manipulation are never acceptable, no matter how they are framed. True respect in a relationship comes from listening, acknowledging, and valuing the other person, not bending them to your will. She thought about the people who had supported her quietly: Tyler, her parents, the few friends who had seen the truth. Gratitude washed over her. It reminded her that she did not have to navigate life alone. Support exists when boundaries are respected and truth is honored. Looking ahead, Sophie felt a quiet optimism. She was intentionally single, not broken. She would rebuild her routines, continue her hobbies, focus on her career, and allow herself to explore new connections on her own terms. Nights of solitude were no longer moments of loneliness, but times to reconnect with herself, her values, and her goals. As she closed her journal that evening, Sophie felt a sense of completion. The relationship had ended, but the story had not broken her. It had strengthened her. She had survived betrayal, upheld her boundaries, and emerged with dignity intact. For anyone watching, she would say this: know your worth. Trust your instincts. Boundaries are not a weakness. They are your strength. Walk away from ultimatums, manipulation, or disregard. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It is survival, growth, and self-respect. Sophie looked out the window one last time, the city lights twinkling softly below. A deep, steady breath filled her lungs. She smiled, quietly, to herself. Life was still ahead, full of possibility, and this time she held the pen.